Negative K, nothing further, just see the candy in the corner.
In a world where love can quickly turn into betrayal, the line between trust and deception often blurs. One woman's heart-wrenching journey unfolds against a backdrop of whispered secrets and hidden motives. She devoted herself to her family, believing that love could conquer all. Yet little did she know that her greatest threat lurked within her own home. What was once a life filled with hopes and dreams spiraled into a nightmare, with deadly consequences lurking in the shadows. The truth emerged slowly, revealing the chilling reality of what love can become when twisted by ambition and greed. The story of Maria Munoz and Joel Pelot, a couple brought together by fate in Puerto Rico, is a poignant reminder of the complexities of love. Maria, a driven student, met Joel, a man 11 years older than her, and their connection was instantaneous. Despite the age difference, they found common ground and quickly built a relationship that seemed destined for success. Maria soon decided to move with Joel to the United States to start a new chapter in their lives together. As the years passed, the couple settled in Laredo, Texas, a bustling city of 250,000 residents. Maria had graduated with a nursing degree and obtained certification as a nurse anesthetist, securing a well-paying job in a hospital. Her colleagues described her as diligent, compassionate, and incredibly hardworking. But despite her professional accomplishments, her family always took precedence. After the birth of her children, Maria decided to quit her job and devote herself entirely to raising them and running the household. On the morning of September 22, 2020, a frantic call came through to 911. The voice on the other end was distressed, desperate, and filled with confusion.
911, what's the address of emergency?
Hold on. I don't know what's on her responses. She's not breathing. She may have taken some pills.
Okay, what is your address?
It was Joel Pelot, Maria's husband, who reported that his wife was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. He mentioned she might have overdosed on medications, though his explanation seemed uncertain. As the dispatcher gave him instructions on performing CPR, Joel tried in vain to revive Maria, but she wasn't breathing. Panic and helplessness echoed in his voice as he repeated the life-saving process over and over, with no success. The first police officer arrived at the scene within minutes. His body camera captured the unfolding events as Joel, clad in a blue surgical gown, hurriedly opened the door and led the officer upstairs to where Maria lay motionless. She was still warm, but there were no signs of life. Joel claimed he had already attempted several cycles of CPR, but they had proven ineffective. The officer joined in the efforts to save her, but their attempts were futile. During these moments of chaos, Joel mentioned that his wife might have taken an excessive amount of prescribed medication, specifically for anxiety, claiming that Maria had been battling mental health issues and had become increasingly depressed. He went to the bathroom and retrieved a packet of pills, handing them over to the officer, suggesting they could be related to her tragic state. Joel implied that Maria had been overwhelmed by her depression, potentially leading her to take her own life. Yet, something about Joel's behavior raised suspicion in the officer's mind. In cases of overdose, it's common for the individual to leave the medication packaging nearby, but there were no such signs in the room where Maria lay. No pills, no syringes, nothing to indicate that she had intentionally ingested a lethal dose of medication. According to Joel, Maria had been a devoted mother, taking the girls for a walk in the park the previous evening. As paramedics arrived and joined in the resuscitation efforts, another detail caught the officer's attention. Earlier, Joel had handed over the packet of pills, but when the officer later looked for them to take a closer look, they had disappeared. Reviewing the body camera footage, the officer noticed something odd. Joel had discreetly picked up the packet and hidden it in his gown pocket. Eventually, confronted by the officer, Joel reluctantly returned the pills. Upon inspection, the detective found that the medication, meant for treating anxiety, was mostly untouched. It was clear that Maria hadn't consumed a large quantity of pills, as Joel had suggested. So, what had really happened? 3 hours after the distressing emergency call was made, the medical team pronounced 31-year-old Maria Munoz dead. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to revive her. The situation, while tragic, immediately raised questions in the minds of the responding detectives, and their attention turned to her husband, Joel Pelot. His behavior was peculiar, erratic even, from the very start. He seemed anxious, on edge, and his explanations about what had transpired that night were inconsistent and strange. Joel admitted to the detectives that there had been ongoing issues in their marriage, to the point where they had been living separately for a while. Despite these issues, he had visited Maria that evening with the hope of reconciling their differences. According to Joel, the evening had started calmly enough. They had a conversation, which he described as peaceful, where they supposedly worked through some of their problems. After putting their 2 young children to bed, Joel claimed they had been intimate, and afterward, he decided to take a shower. Upon returning from the bathroom, he said he found Maria unconscious on the bed. Panicked, he called 911 and tried to revive her, but it was already too late. From the moment Joel shared his story, the law enforcement officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They carefully observed him, and it didn't take long for his strange behavior to deepen their suspicions. Joel was sweating profusely, which seemed odd given that he was only wearing a light gown and the house was not particularly warm. His body appeared drenched in sweat, as though he had been under extreme physical or emotional stress, or worse, possibly under the influence of substances. This excessive perspiration, coupled with his erratic body language, immediately raised red flags. His story about what had happened seemed rehearsed, detached from the reality of the situation. Moreover, when asked about Maria, Joel painted a picture of a troubled woman, battling depression and anxiety, someone who, according to him, refused any form of professional help. He mentioned that she had recently become more religious, seeking solace in the church, but even that hadn't alleviated her distress. He claimed she refused to see a psychotherapist despite his insistence. Joel suggested that Maria had reached her breaking point and might have chosen to end her life. However, it wasn't just Joel's odd demeanor that made the detective skeptical. His account of Maria's mental state seemed exaggerated, almost as if he was trying to shift suspicion away from himself by painting her as someone on the edge of a breakdown. The detectives weren't convinced. Joel also told them that Maria had started keeping a diary, hoping to process her dark thoughts by writing them down. This diary was soon found during a search of the house, and it painted a much more nuanced picture of Maria's struggles. In its pages, she had detailed her fears and insecurities. She wrote about her anxiety over losing her family, her dread of how divorce might affect her children, and her concerns about her husband's growing distance. The diary revealed a woman under immense emotional strain, but it also showed that she deeply cherished her children and was committed to her family, despite the turmoil she was experiencing. As the detectives pored over Maria's words and tried to piece together her final days, they began considering various possibilities. One theory was that Maria had indeed tried to take her own life by overdosing on medication. Another theory was that it could have been an accidental overdose. Perhaps she had taken more medication than intended. But there was also a third, more sinister possibility, that Joel had played a direct role in his wife's death. When the police requested to search the house, Joel initially refused. He claimed to be a very private person, uncomfortable with strangers going through his belongings. This reluctance only fueled the detectives' suspicions further. They explained that a search would be necessary regardless, once a warrant was obtained, but urged him to cooperate voluntarily to expedite the process. After some hesitation, Joel eventually agreed, though his initial resistance had already left a lasting impression on the investigators. As they examined the house, the detectives continued to speak with Joel, becoming increasingly convinced that he was not in his right mind. His movements were erratic. He struggled to stand still or maintain eye contact. His constant sweating and inability to focus suggested he was under the influence of something. Eventually, they invited him to the station for further questioning, where his behavior only became more bizarre. Joel couldn't sit still, frequently bumping into furniture, and seemed utterly disoriented. At one point, left alone in the interrogation room, he broke down, crying and screaming, pounding the walls in frustration. The formal interrogation began around 4 a.m., and Joel repeated his earlier claims. He said that he was the one who had picked up Maria's medication from the pharmacy, though he couldn't remember how many pills were in the packet initially. While it's not uncommon for people to forget such details, his inability to provide clear answers about the medication only added to the detective's suspicions. When asked again about the events leading up to Maria's collapse, Joel reiterated his story about taking a shower. According to him, he had only been gone for about 10 minutes, and when he returned, Maria was already unconscious. But the timeline didn't add up. The detectives knew that the medication Maria allegedly took wouldn't have acted so quickly, nor would it have been powerful enough to kill her in such a short span of time. But it was the details about the supposed shower that truly unraveled Joel's story. When the detectives inspected the bathroom, they found that it was completely dry. No steam, no moisture on the walls or floor, not even a damp towel. It was clear that Joel had not taken a shower, despite his repeated claims. The glaring inconsistency, coupled with his erratic behavior, made it increasingly apparent that he was hiding something. During the meticulous search of the house, detectives came across disturbing clues that hinted at foul play. They found a needle, the type used for intravenous injections, and a medical packet stashed in separate parts of the home. Intriguingly, this type of needle is often used for administering IV drips, equipment they also found in the home's medicine cabinet, along with other syringes and IV lines. However, Maria Munoz hadn't been prescribed any medication that would require intravenous administration. Her prescriptions were all for oral medications. This peculiar discovery deepened the detective's suspicions, as it didn't fit the narrative Joel had presented, raising more questions about his role in her death. To gain further insight, the detectives turned to Maria's friends and family. One close friend of the deceased came forward with crucial information. This friend, along with her husband, had rushed to Maria's house upon hearing the tragic news, intending to take care of Maria's 2 young children. It was during this emotional moment, while the search was ongoing, that the police interviewed them. They hoped this friend could shed light on why so much medical equipment was present in the house, particularly since it seemed irrelevant to Maria's treatment plan. The friend's account painted a troubling picture of Joel, one that contradicted the caring husband persona he had tried to portray. She described how, 2 years before Maria's death, Joel had undergone a significant transformation. He had suddenly started losing weight, only to rapidly build muscle afterward, which, to those around him, suggested he was using anabolic steroids. Alongside this physical transformation, there was a noticeable change in his behavior. Joel, who had once been a loving husband and father, began flirting openly with other women, even in front of Maria. His behavior became more brazen, and his social media profiles reflected this new version of himself. Where once he had posted pictures of family outings and shared moments with his wife and children, his profiles were now dominated by selfies showcasing his sculpted physique and posts bragging about his financial success. Joel even bought an expensive sports car that originally belonged to Maria and often flaunted it among his friends, boasting about his lifestyle. His family, once the cornerstone of his life, seemed to have taken a back seat, replaced by a growing narcissism. Things took a turn for the worse after the birth of their second child in 2018. Around this time, Joel developed an infatuation with a surgical ward nurse named Janet Aranda, who worked with him and Maria at the hospital. Their relationship, initially discreet, quickly turned into an affair. Joel was so smitten that he took Janet on a lavish trip to Europe, where they visited Spain, France, and Greece. This vacation was a turning point in Maria's life. She had long suspected something was off, but had no concrete proof until she stumbled upon plane tickets with Janet's name on them. Up until then, Maria had noticed Joel's increasing closeness with Janet, but had convinced herself it was innocent. The discovery of those tickets, however, confirmed her worst fears. Her husband had been unfaithful. This revelation sent Maria into a deep depression. She struggled with her emotions, torn between her love for Joel and the pain of his betrayal. She confided her feelings in her diary, where she expressed her fears about the future of their family. Maria didn't want her children to grow up without a father, but the emotional toll of staying in the marriage was unbearable. Despite her pain, she tried to make it work. For the sake of the children, Maria was willing to forgive Joel, but only if he ended the affair and committed to their family. It appeared that Joel had, for a brief time, convinced Maria that he had chosen to remain with his family. He confessed to ending his relationship with Janet and even planned a luxurious trip to Las Vegas as a gesture of reconciliation. Along with expensive gifts, Joel tried to present himself as a man who had learned from his mistakes and wanted to make amends. Sadly, this was far from the truth. The Las Vegas trip and the gifts were all part of Joel's web of lies. He never intended to stop seeing Janet and, as the investigation later revealed, had been carrying on the affair for over 2 years, right up until Maria's untimely death. The detectives pressed Joel during his police interrogation. Initially, he stuck to the story that he and Maria had been having marital problems, but claimed he had done everything possible to mend the relationship. However, under the weight of questioning, he admitted that their marriage was on the verge of collapse and that 5 months prior, he had moved out of the house to live with Janet. While this confession aligned with some of the information detectives had already gathered, it was clear that Joel was still withholding key details. Detectives decided to pay Janet a visit. Early in the morning, they called her and asked her to clarify her relationship with Joel and what she knew about Maria's sudden death. Janet seemed surprised, although it was unclear whether her shock was genuine or a performance. The investigators informed her that Maria had died only 8 hours earlier, but they reassured her that they weren't yet treating it as a murder case. At this stage, they were simply gathering information to understand the circumstances leading up to the tragedy and to rule out any improbable scenarios. The search of the house and the mounting testimony from those close to the family painted a dark picture of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal. Joel's odd behavior, the suspicious medical equipment, and his shifting stories all pointed to something more sinister than the simple suicide narrative he had initially tried to sell. Maria's death was now far from just a tragic accident. It was the result of a complex web of lies and deceit, with Joel at the center of it all. As the investigation deepened, the detectives knew that the truth would eventually come to light, but they had a long road ahead before they could piece together exactly what had transpired that night. The detectives exercised caution, refraining from jumping to conclusions as they awaited the crucial autopsy results. These results would be pivotal in clarifying the precise cause of Maria Munoz's sudden and tragic death. Meanwhile, Janet Aranda, Joel's mistress, arrived at the station for questioning. During the interrogation, she readily admitted to having been in a relationship with Joel for over 2 years, a detail that she seemed unapologetic about. Throughout this period, Joel had never once mentioned that Maria had any issues with substance abuse, nor had he spoken of her indulging in drugs or any self-harm tendencies. Instead, he often expressed his concern about Maria's ongoing depression, emphasizing how she seemed to be sinking deeper into her emotional struggles. The detectives subtly hinted to Janet that Maria's death was not as straightforward as it might seem. They floated the possibility that Maria had not died from natural causes, nor from a simple overdose. The investigators suggested that if Joel were involved in his wife's death, Janet herself might be at risk. However, Janet remained firm. She stated that Joel had never mentioned any intention to harm his wife, nor had he made any threats or derogatory remarks about her. She refused to believe that Joel could be involved in Maria's death, although she was visibly shaken by the idea that foul play was even being considered. Janet's calm demeanor, cooperative attitude, and solid alibi led the investigators to conclude that she was not involved in Maria's death, and they decided to exclude her from their list of suspects. Soon afterward, the forensic analysis provided a major breakthrough. No traces of pills were found in Maria's stomach, not even those that she had been prescribed before her death. This was significant because, as Joel claimed, if Maria had taken pills just before he went to shower, the medication wouldn't have had enough time to dissolve, let alone cause such a sudden death in just 10 minutes. The autopsy determined that the cause of Maria's death was massive mixed intoxication. This raised an important question. How had these drugs entered her system? The careful examination of Maria's body revealed a critical clue. A small puncture, indicative of an intravenous injection, was found in the crook of her elbow. This strongly suggested that the drugs had been administered via IV rather than orally. Blood tests confirmed that Maria had died from the combined effects of several potent drugs, although the precise substances had yet to be identified. The investigators ordered a full toxicological analysis to determine the exact cocktail of drugs that had caused her death. Unfortunately, they were told that this analysis could take up to 4 months, forcing the detectives to wait for more concrete answers. Despite the slow-moving toxicology results, the initial findings cast serious doubt on the theory of suicide. Administering drugs intravenously would have been difficult, if not impossible, for Maria to do on her own. Additionally, it seemed unlikely that a mother who found comfort in her children would take such a drastic step. Everyone close to Maria had stated that, despite the intense strain on her marriage, her children were her primary source of joy and hope. Friends and family confirmed that Maria had never struggled with addiction or abused substances, and there was nothing in her background to suggest that she had ever considered suicide. Detectives meticulously combed through Maria's personal diary, searching for any clue that might indicate her intent to end her life. However, they found nothing. On the contrary, the diary revealed a woman deeply affected by the turmoil in her marriage, but one who was determined to endure and overcome her struggles. The notes made just days before her death were particularly revealing. Maria wrote about her growing disappointment with Joel, especially after he moved in with Janet. Yet, instead of wallowing in despair, Maria seemed resolved to make significant changes in her life. She had decided to divorce Joel and was eager to move forward, raising her children on her own and starting fresh. This new determination made the detectives increasingly suspicious that Maria's death was not voluntary. It didn't seem plausible that a woman who was prepared to make a fresh start would suddenly choose to end her life, leaving her children behind. As the investigation continued, everyone who had known and loved Maria gathered to say their final goodbyes at her funeral. Despite the strained relationship he had with Maria at the time of her death, Joel attended the funeral as well. He was visibly emotional, crying profusely throughout the ceremony. At one point, he even kissed Maria's coffin, his face contorted with grief. To outsiders, Joel's display might have seemed like genuine sorrow, but to Maria's close friends and family, his behavior felt contrived. After all, it was common knowledge that Joel and Maria had been living apart and that Joel had been involved with another woman for some time. The stark contrast between Joel's public display of grief and his recent actions left many feeling uneasy. One of Maria's close friends, who had been privy to the couple's troubles, could no longer hold back her frustration. Watching Joel sob over Maria's coffin, she confronted him, accusing him of insincerity. She voiced what many others at the funeral had been thinking but didn't dare say aloud: that Joel's exaggerated sorrow felt more like a performance than a true expression of loss. He had been living a double life, flaunting his relationship with Janet, while Maria struggled with the pain of his betrayal. Now, at the funeral, his overt displays of grief seemed hollow and hypocritical to those who knew the full story. This outburst at the funeral only fueled the growing suspicion surrounding Joel's involvement in Maria's death. The detectives, who had already been skeptical of Joel's narrative, saw this as yet another piece of the puzzle. They knew that until the toxicology report came back, they would have to rely on circumstantial evidence. But every new detail painted a more incriminating picture of Joel's role in the events leading up to Maria's death. With the forensic timeline set in motion and Maria's diary offering a glimpse into her final days, the investigation into her tragic end was far from over. The detectives were determined to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. Joel's exaggerated sorrow and his erratic behavior only reinforced their suspicions. They had already begun treating the case as a murder investigation, with Joel as the primary suspect. His attempt to conceal the packet of pills during the initial search was a red flag, even though it was later confirmed that the pills were not linked to Maria's death. The needle found on the stairs and the medical equipment discovered in the house raised further suspicion, but none of this evidence was strong enough to bring formal charges against him. Even the forensic experts struggled to provide a definitive cause of death. In their quest for more information, the detectives turned to Maria's friends, hoping they might shed light on the events leading up to her death. Though they still couldn't prove who had administered the lethal injection, the conversations with Maria's close circle revealed some crucial details. According to her friends, on the Saturday before her death, Maria had a heated argument with Joel. She had grown increasingly fed up with his infidelity and demanded that he make a choice between her and Janet. When Joel chose his mistress without hesitation, Maria was furious. She stormed out of the house, got into her car, and declared that she would file for divorce. Joel's response was explosive. He struck the windshield of her car with such force that he shattered it, clearly unwilling to entertain the idea of divorce. On Sunday morning, Maria followed through on her threat. She texted Joel, informing him that she was looking for a lawyer to initiate the divorce process. Joel, however, responded with attempts to downplay the situation. He argued that hiring lawyers would be expensive and time-consuming, suggesting instead that they could come to an agreement on their own. He proposed meeting in person to discuss the terms of the separation without any legal involvement. Despite her growing mistrust of Joel, Maria agreed to meet him on Monday evening. Before Joel's arrival, Maria sent a message to a close friend, asking her to pray for her. Although she was apprehensive about how the conversation would unfold, she didn't feel as though she was in any immediate danger. She was concerned, yes, but not frightened. Tragically, this message would be the last time anyone heard from Maria. By early Tuesday morning, she was pronounced dead. For 4 long months, the detectives waited for the results of the full toxicological examination, knowing that this would be the key to unlocking the mystery of Maria's death. When the results finally arrived, they confirmed the detectives' worst fears. Maria's blood contained traces of 7 powerful drugs, including morphine, propofol, etomidate, and lidocaine. This dangerous mixture of drugs, commonly used in surgical settings, had been administered intravenously. None of the medications found in her system were substances to which Maria had access, but her husband certainly did. Joel, a hospital worker, would have had access to these drugs, strengthening the detectives' belief that he was involved in his wife's death. Armed with this information, the detectives felt they had enough to arrest Joel. Within an hour of receiving the toxicology results, police officers arrived at Joel's home, where he was spending the evening with Janet. He didn't resist when they handcuffed him, maintaining a calm, stoic demeanor as he was led away. At the station, however, Joel refused to testify and immediately demanded a lawyer, refusing to provide any further information about the events leading up to Maria's death. The prosecution, meanwhile, wasted no time in building their case. They believed that Joel had prepared the lethal cocktail of drugs and injected it into Maria intravenously. But despite their growing confidence in Joel's guilt, there remained one key mystery. How had Joel managed to administer the injection? There was no direct evidence to suggest that Maria had been forcibly injected, nor were there any signs that she had been drugged or restrained before her death. To answer this question, the detectives turned to Joel's former boss, an anesthesiologist who had worked with Joel for many years. When the detectives showed him the list of drugs found in Maria's blood, the doctor was stunned. He was especially alarmed by the presence of propofol, a powerful anesthetic that can be fatal if not carefully administered. In fact, the amount of propofol in Maria's system was far higher than any dosage typically used, even in major surgeries. According to the anesthesiologist, the dose was not only lethal but excessive. So much so that it seemed the killer wanted to ensure there would be no chance of survival. With this chilling revelation, the detectives realized they needed to revisit Janet. Her initial interrogation had cleared her as a suspect, but they now believed she might know more than she had let on. They obtained a warrant to search her home, hoping to find evidence linking her to the crime. However, the search yielded nothing. There were no needles, no vials of medication, and no physical evidence to tie Janet to Maria's death. Realizing they needed her cooperation, the detectives offered Janet a deal: immunity from prosecution in exchange for full disclosure of what she knew about Joel's actions. This time, Janet was more forthcoming. In the presence of her lawyers, she confessed that Joel had been bringing medications home from work for months. He would often use some of the drugs himself, though she wasn't always sure why. Janet named several of the drugs he had brought home, and to the detective's surprise, 6 of them matched the substances found in Maria's blood. After a moment of hesitation, Janet added one final, crucial detail. Shortly before Maria's death, Joel had brought home a vial of propofol. This revelation was the final piece of the puzzle. With Janet's testimony and the toxicology report, the prosecution had enough to formally charge Joel with the murder of his wife. They now believed that Joel had prepared the deadly mixture of drugs, and either through deception or force, injected them into Maria, ensuring her death. Janet's admission about the propofol not only corroborated the toxicology findings, but also provided a direct link between Joel and the fatal drugs. With this new evidence, the prosecution was confident that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Joel had murdered his wife. Pending the trial, Joel was initially released on bail, but his freedom was short-lived. Soon after, he was detained again and charged with falsifying evidence in an apparent attempt to hinder the investigation. His second release on bail raised eyebrows, but strict conditions were imposed, including house arrest until the trial, which began in March 2023. This trial was bound to be complex, with no direct evidence tying Joel to the murder, but the prosecution was determined to prove their case. They summoned over a dozen witnesses to build a circumstantial web of proof, hoping to convince the jury that Joel's actions weren't the result of a tragic mistake, but a carefully premeditated plan to murder his wife, Maria. The crux of the prosecution's case lay in proving Joel had a motive. They argued that the couple's deteriorating relationship had taken a nosedive 2 months prior to Maria's death, during which Joel resorted to physical violence. Divorce was looming, and Maria was determined to walk away from the marriage, taking with her a significant portion of the assets they had acquired together. This would have left Joel facing a financial catastrophe, with alimony and severance payments amounting to nearly $1 million. For a man like Joel, this was enough reason to kill. To bolster their argument, the prosecution presented Maria's diaries, which painted a damning picture of the couple's final months together. In addition to the diaries, they uncovered a vital piece of evidence: a video on Maria's phone from 4 months before her death. In this recording, Maria was seen speaking calmly to her husband in their car, attempting to reconcile and save the family. Joel, however, was visibly agitated and responded in an erratic and aggressive manner. The video provided a glimpse into the kind of relationship they had and Joel's volatile temperament. But one significant question lingered throughout the trial. How had Joel convinced Maria to accept a lethal injection? The prosecution believed they had the answer. They theorized that Joel had slipped a powerful sedative into Maria's coffee, rendering her more compliant. Once she became groggy and disoriented, Joel likely offered to help her by administering medication intravenously, something Maria trusted him to do because of his medical background. Even though the couple was in the midst of separating, Maria still saw Joel as someone capable of helping in a moment of distress. The sedative, combined with the lethal drugs Joel had prepared in advance, left her defenseless. According to the medical experts, each drug in the deadly cocktail could cause unconsciousness individually, but together, they ensured Maria had no chance of resisting or surviving. Joel's actions left little doubt about his intentions. The prosecution argued that he had clearly planned the murder well in advance, securing the medications and preparing the lethal mix before visiting his wife. Despite their lack of direct evidence, the prosecution had one key witness: Janet, Joel's mistress. She confessed that before Joel left to meet Maria on the day of her death, he told her he was going to give his wife an injection. Janet claimed that Joel did not intend to kill Maria but wanted to calm her down to make her more agreeable during the divorce negotiations. While this statement might have seemed like an attempt to defend Joel's actions, it only confirmed his involvement in the fatal injection. Janet's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, cementing Joel's guilt in the jury's mind. But there was more. The prosecution also accused Joel of delaying his call to emergency services. They argued that Joel intentionally waited until it was too late to save Maria, buying himself enough time to dispose of the syringe and any other incriminating evidence. Joel's attempt to mislead the investigation by tampering with evidence only strengthened the prosecution's argument that this was no accident but a deliberate act of murder. During the trial, Joel admitted to giving Maria an injection, but insisted he had no malicious intent. His defense team argued that Maria had been struggling with depression, abusing alcohol and medication for months before the tragedy. According to Joel's lawyers, Maria had accidentally taken too many pills, and Joel had attempted to counteract the overdose by administering drugs to reverse the effects. Unfortunately, he mistakenly gave her propofol, which exacerbated her condition rather than alleviating it. They claimed Joel's actions were an honest mistake, a tragic accident rather than premeditated murder. After 8 intense days of testimony on March 30th, 2023, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. The speed of their decision reflected the strength of the prosecution's case. Joel Pellet, 45 years old, was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Maria Munoz. He was also convicted of falsifying evidence in an attempt to obstruct the investigation. For these crimes, Joel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole in 2053. An additional 10 years were tacked onto his sentence for his efforts to conceal the evidence of the crime.